My brother brought a locksmith to my house at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning. Not to our mother's house. Not to some family property, still tied up in probate. Not to a rental with both our names on the paperwork. My house. The one I bought 3 years earlier under Nora Whitaker. The one with my mortgage. My insurance. My utility bills. My camera system. My tax record. And the front porch light I replaced myself, after the old fixture started buzzing in the rain, and he stood on my front walk like he was doing me a favor. I was in the kitchen, barefoot, halfway through my first coffee, when my phone buzzed with the front camera alert. 3 people, Grant in a navy quarter zip, a locksmith in a gray polo carrying a metal case, and a woman from next door, Marisol Kent, standing on her lawn in a robe, with her arms folded. Because Marisol missed nothing and trusted even less. I opened the camera feed and heard Grant say, "She's inside. She won't open up because she knows she's not supposed to be here." That sentence woke me up better than caffeine ever could. Not supposed to be here. The fastest way to understand a man is to hear how easily he lies when he thinks the person he's erasing is still behind the door. I set my mug down so carefully, it made me angrier. Grant had always liked performance more than fact. He was the kind of man who ironed confidence onto bad information and expected the room to salute the crease. He did it at funerals, in bank offices, around women he dated for 6 months and called basically family, and especially around me, because growing up, he learned something dangerous. If he moved fast and spoke first, adults often confused him for the reasonable child. Not me anymore. I didn't rush outside. That mattered. People think control looks dramatic. It doesn't. Most of the time, it looks like waiting long enough to let the other person reveal the full stupidity of their plan. So, I watched. The locksmith, to his credit, didn't touch the deadbolt right away. He asked Grant something I couldn't fully hear. Grant answered louder. For effect, "It's a family situation," he said. "My mother's estate is being mishandled, and my sister's refusing to cooperate. This property is part of the dispute. Lee. Clean. Efficient Lee. The house had never belonged to our mother, never passed through her estate, never been attached to any trust. Family LLC. Sid letter. Verbal promise. Or dying wish mythology. Grant usually liked to weaponize when money entered the room. It was mine. Bought after 12 years in healthcare compliance. Bought with a down payment I scraped together through overtime. 1 canceled vacation. 2 brutal contract years. And a level of loneliness nobody praises, because women are only admired for sacrifice when the sacrifice stays useful to other people. And now Grant was outside trying to convert my labor into family confusion. Classic. Marisol, still planted on her lawn, called across the hedge. "Did Nora ask you to be here?" "Bless that woman." The locksmith hesitated. Grant smiled the way men smile when a woman has said something inconvenient but not yet expensive. "She's emotional," he said. "I'm trying to keep this from getting uglier than it needs to. There are insults that hit your pride. Then there are insults that clarify the entire structure. Emotional. That word told me exactly how he planned to play it if I stepped outside too early. Grant as problem solver. Nora as unstable. Grant as family representative. Nora as difficult holdout. No. Not today. I hit record on my phone, pulled on jeans, and called the sheriff's non-emergency line. By the time I gave my address, the locksmith had finally set his case down on my porch. That was the moment it crossed from offensive to actionable. I told dispatch, very calmly, "My brother is attempting an unlawful entry with a locksmith at my residence. I'm the titled owner, and I'm inside the home." You could almost hear the dispatcher sit up straighter. "Do not open the door until a deputy arrives," she said. Already planned. I went back to the camera feed. Grant had moved closer to the front step. Hands on hips. Head tilted. like he was auditioning for the role of patient relative in a bad cable drama. He looked directly into the doorbell camera and said, "Nora, if you make me do this in front of the neighborhood, that's on you." Another excellent sentence. Because manipulative people always tell you who they are if you let them keep talking long enough. He wasn't embarrassed to bring a locksmith to my house. He was embarrassed that witnesses might force him to own the version of himself required to do it. Grant wasn't afraid of being wrong. He was afraid of having to be wrong on camera. I opened the side blind just enough to see the street. 2 more neighbors had started looking. A delivery van slowed. Then moved on. Marisol was still there. Now, with coffee in one hand, like she intended to watch this through to the credits. Then the locksmith said the first smart thing anyone on Grant's side had said all morning. "I need proof of legal authority before I touch that lock." Grant answered too fast. "I told you. It's inherited property." Inherited. Interesting. Different lie from the first one. That's the problem with men who bluff on adrenaline. They don't curate. They just stack language and hope confidence caulks the seams. I almost smiled. Because by then I knew this was over. Grant just didn't know it yet. A patrol SUV turned onto the street 3 minutes later. Deputy Ellis Boone stepped out. One hand resting near his vest. Not aggressive. Not friendly. Just professionally tired in the way law enforcement gets, when they can already smell a domestic property lie before the engine cools. Grant straightened immediately. Of course he did. Men like my brother love uniforms when they still think they can recruit them into their version. Deputy Boone spoke to the locksmith first. Then to Grant. Then looked toward the house. I opened the front door, but kept the storm door locked. That detail mattered too. Barrier in place. Voice clear. Record running. Grant turned. Saw me. And actually had the nerve to say, "Finally." Deputy Boone looked from him to me, and asked one question. Just one. "Who is on the deed?" "Who is on the deed?" Deputy Ellis Boone asked it like a man who had already decided this morning. Would improve dramatically the moment somebody stopped using family language and started using nouns that can be verified. Grant smiled before I could answer. That told me a lot. It meant he still thought speed could beat fact. That if he jumped in first, used the right words, sounded slightly wounded and deeply inconvenienced, the deputy might start organizing the scene around his confidence instead of my documents. Grant had been getting away with that since middle school. Teachers thought he was spirited. Aunt Denise thought he was natural leadership. My mother, God help her, called it presence. Right up until the day he talked a contractor into believing he had authority to approve demolition work in her kitchen and nearly cost her $11,000 in corrective repairs. I was the one who caught the permit discrepancy. I was the one who spent a Saturday morning on hold with the county. I was the one who got called rigid for not laughing it off. That was our pattern. Grant entered rooms like ownership was a mood. Nora entered with folders. Guess which style gets underestimated until money is on fire? By the time Deputy Boone showed up on my front walk, that pattern had already been running between us for 27 years. Grant the older brother. Grant the loud son. Grant the one who liked to narrate first and apologize, never. Me. The younger sister who didn't look threatening until the paperwork came out, and because I don't perform dominance the way men expect it, people often get the setup wrong at first. They see a woman in a cardigan behind a locked storm door, and a brother outside speaking in complete sentences. And they assume the conflict is emotional before it's structural. That assumption is expensive, especially for women like me. I bought that house after my divorce from Owen Pike, yes. The same Owen Pike who once explained to a dinner party that Nora doesn't really relax. She optimizes. Everyone laughed. I filed taxes alone 3 months later. Best optimization decision I ever made. After the divorce, I was 36. Working as a senior compliance analyst for a regional healthcare network. Living in a 1-bedroom rental with thin walls and a landlord who thought mildew was seasonal. I took every ugly assignment no one else wanted. Post-merger audit cleanup. Controlled substance storage review. vendor dispute remediation, reimbursement tracebacks, the kind of work people with charming careers call tedious because they've never had their stability depend on being better than chaos. That work bought the house. Not inheritance. Not family help. Not a secret loan. Not a shared arrangement that later got messy in memory. Me. My salary. Me bonus. My discipline. My insomnia. My credit score. My wire transfer. My signatures. Grant kept calling it a family house because men like him can't stand a woman owning something expensive that has no emotional backdoor through them. The house sat in a quiet part of Arlington, on a short street where the lots were narrow, but the property taxes were not. 2 bedrooms, renovated kitchen, old maple in the front yard. A finished basement I almost didn't buy because the inspection found a grading issue near the rear drain. I negotiated the correction into closing, tracked the contractor work myself, and kept every receipt in cloud storage and hard copy because nothing teaches you to value proof like dealing with men who assume confidence counts as evidence. Grant had been inside that house exactly 4 times. Once for the housewarming, where he brought bourbon and said, "Feels aggressive for one person." Once the Christmas after, when he asked if I'd thought about leveraging the equity smarter. Once to drop off a framed family photo I never hung. And once 8 months earlier, after our mother died, when he walked through the living room, stood too long in the foyer, and said, "It's weird that you ended up with the nicest place." Not congratulations, not pride, weird, as if my life had broken some unspoken rule. That's the context people miss when they hear a story like this. They think the locksmith was the beginning. It wasn't. The locksmith was just the first time Grant made the underlying belief visible enough for other people to see, that anything stable around me must secretly belong to a story larger than my own effort. Our mother, Lorraine Whitaker, made that belief worse without meaning to. She loved us unevenly, but described it evenly, which is a very dangerous maternal skill. Grant got forgiven in advance. I got trusted in retrospect. Grant was complicated. I was capable. He missed deadlines, I covered them. He forgot birthdays, I remembered medication lists. He arrived late with opinions, I arrived early with batteries. Paper towels. And the correct bank routing number. Families love the daughter who can solve things. They just don't like what it means when she starts naming what she solved. When Mom died, that whole dynamic hardened. She had rented, not owned. There was no estate fortune, no sacred parcel of land, no dramatic trust document, just a modest life insurance policy, a checking account, some jewelry, a car with transmission problems, and a storage unit full of things she had saved because throwing things away felt too close to admitting time existed. Grant still found a way to turn grief into contest. He wanted to take lead on sorting, wanted to centralize decisions, wanted access to my garage temporarily because my house had more room and that's what family does. No. I let him store 3 labeled bins for exactly 2 weeks. Documented pickup and drop-off by text. Then moved everything out, because men who say temporarily around square footage are rarely talking about time. He acted hurt, then strategic, then vague, and somewhere in the months after the funeral, I started noticing he no longer referred to my place as Nora's house every time. Sometimes it was the house, sometimes your place. Os. Memorably, the property, said with a half-joking investor tone that made my skin go cold. That's when I installed the exterior camera upgrade. Not because I thought he'd bring a locksmith, because I had finally learned to stop waiting for male entitlement to become illegal before treating it as risk. Deputy Boone stood on my porch that Tuesday morning asking the simplest question in the world, who is on the deed, because he understood something Grant never would. Ownership is boring until someone without it decides they deserve a shortcut. Grant opened his mouth to answer for me. Of course he did. And I said, through the locked storm door, in the calmest voice I had, Nora Whitaker is the only name on the deed. And Nora has the county copy inside. Nora Whitaker is the only name on the deed. And Nora has the county copy inside. I said it clearly. Not loudly. Not with the tremor Grant wanted. Deputy Boone gave one short nod. The kind people use when a situation has just shifted from fog to geometry. Grant, unfortunately for himself, kept talking. That's not the full story, he said. Our mother intended this place to stay in the family. And Nora knows that. Lee? Not emotional lie. Not grief-struck exaggeration. Strategically. Our mother had never seen that house. She died 8 months before I even toured it. She had never walked through the kitchen. Never stood under the maple in the front yard. Never complained about the basement ceiling height, or asked whether the water heater had been replaced. She could not possibly have intended anything about a property she had never known existed, and Grant knew that, which made what he was doing uglier than ordinary entitlement. He wasn't confused. He was manufacturing moral fog around a fixed legal fact, because he thought family language would make witnesses flinch away from precision. Marisol did not flinch. From her lawn, she said. Lorraine never lived there. Bless her again. The locksmith glanced at Grant, then at the deputy, then at me, through the storm door. Already, the room had started breaking against reality, but Grant still had one more move left. And it was the kind that enrages me, because it works more often than it should. He actually sighed. Then he said, Nora's been under strain since the divorce. And she gets obsessive about control. I'm trying to keep this from becoming a mental health thing. There it was. The threshold insult. Not just false. Not just cruel. Public. Calculated. Designed to damage. He hadn't come to my house just to force entry. He had come prepared to discredit me in front of law enforcement and neighbors if he needed a softer weapon than a locksmith. Grant didn't bring the locksmith because he thought the law was on his side. He brought slander as the backup tool in case the law asked questions. Deputy Boone's expression flattened. That told me 2 things. First, he had heard this trick before. Second, Grant had just made the mistake of sounding rehearsed. I kept one hand on the storm door latch and said, Deputy Boone, I'd like that noted. My brother has brought a tradesman to my home under false authority and is now making false statements about my mental state after I stated that I am the sole deed holder. Specificity matters. If you say he's lying, people hear conflict. If you say false authority, false statements, and sole deed holder, people hear structure. Grant snapped immediately. Oh. Come on. Nora. Don't do the corporate voice thing with me. Wrong. That was exactly the voice to use. Because men like Grant survive by dragging everything back into sibling mess tone. Old wounds. Family resentment. You always do this. I'm just trying to help. If I stayed inside that arena, he could keep improvising. Once I moved it into verifiable language, his options narrowed fast. Deputy Boone asked Grant, Do you have any deed? Court order. Lease. Probate directive. Or written authorization to enter this residence. Grant hesitated, just for a beat. But enough, then he said. It's a family dispute. Not an answer. The locksmith picked up his case. That was another beautiful moment. A working man deciding he had no desire to become Exhibit A in somebody else's sibling delusion. He said, I'm not touching that lock. Grant turned on him too fast. You already came out here. And there it was again, his actual operating system. Pressure the nearest person with less social standing and hope motion substitutes for legitimacy. The locksmith shrugged once. I came because you told me you had authority. The deputy looked at Grant. Marisol looked at Grant. I looked at Grant. For the first time, all morning. He looked slightly smaller. That should have ended it. A decent man would have backed off. A merely selfish one would have pretended misunderstanding and left. Grant did neither. Instead, he stepped onto my porch, came right up to the locked storm door, and lowered his voice into something ugly and intimate. You think a piece of paper makes this yours? He said. You think hiding in here changes where that down payment came from? That line hit harder than the mental health slur. Because now we were at the real theft. Not the house. My work. I bought that house with money from my severance package after the divorce. 2 performance bonuses. And the sale of the last condo Owen and I had shared. Grant knew that. He also knew our mother had left each of us a small insurance payout after funeral expenses less than $20,000 each. Useful money. Yes. Down payment money in part. Yes. But not even close to house-defining money in Arlington. And still he was doing what men like him always do around women's assets. Take one family origin dollar and inflate it into ownership mythology. As if any trace of shared blood can nullify years of solitary effort, Grant couldn't steal Nora's deed. So he tried to steal the story of how she earned it. I didn't answer him immediately. I reached behind me to the entry table. I took the county-certified deed copy from the file folder where I keep property records and held it up against the glass. Then I held up the settlement statement, then the mortgage statement, then the homeowner's insurance declaration page. On it be one. No speech. No shaking. Just paper. Deputy Boone actually stepped closer to read. Grant saw that and knew the moment was slipping. So he escalated. He pointed at the documents and said, loudly enough for the whole street, "Fine. Then let's talk about the fact that Nora used Mom's money and cut family out anyway. There. Public humiliation attempt. Maximum reach. Neighborhood audience. Family shame as weapon." Marisol set her coffee mug down on her porch rail like she was preparing for impact. And I realized, suddenly, that Grant had not just come to get into my house. He had come to overwrite my legitimacy in front of anyone available to witness it. So I opened the inner door, kept the storm door locked, looked directly at Deputy Boone, and said, "The settlement statement shows exactly what Nora used to buy this house. And if my brother wants to discuss Mom's money, then we should also discuss what Grant did with his share." Grant went completely still. That was new. Because greed can survive exposure, but fraud hates context. Grant went completely still. That was the first useful thing he'd done all morning. Because men like my brother survive on motion. On speed. En interruption. On making the other person defend too early. Explain too much. Or sound emotional enough that the facts start looking negotiable. Stillness ruins that, and I had just handed him stillness. Not by shouting. Not by exposing everything at once. Just by placing one sentence in the open air. We should also discuss what Grant did with his share. Deputy Boone looked at me, then at Grant, then back at me. He didn't ask me to continue. That was another detail I appreciated. Good deputies understand pacing. They know the most revealing thing in a domestic property confrontation is not always the accusation. It's who starts scrambling to pre-edit the next sentence. Grant scrambled immediately. "That has nothing to do with this," he said. Exactly. That was how I knew it had everything to do with this. Because if the subject were irrelevant, he would have laughed it off. Mocked me. Told the deputy I was deflecting. But Grant has always had one fatal weakness. When a fact threatens his preferred narrative, he rushes to quarantine it before anyone can ask the natural follow-up. I said nothing. I just set the settlement statement flat against the glass where Deputy Boone could see the numbers. Then the wire confirmation. Then, the first page of the mortgage. Grant started talking again to fill the space. "Our mother wanted us to look out for each other," he said. "Nora gets competitive when assets come up. Still trying. Still performing. Still using the soft focus language of family values while standing next to a locksmith he had brought under false pretenses to my front door. Grant kept calling it family because attempted forced entry based on imaginary inheritance sounds much worse in plain English. Marisol snorted loudly enough for everyone to hear. That helped. Not because I needed backup. Because contempt from an uninvolved neighbor is socially devastating in a way legal language sometimes isn't by. It punctures the performance. Deputy Boone held up one hand. "Mr. Whitaker," he said. "Stop speaking for a moment. Grant, shut up. That might have been my favorite sound of the entire morning. The deputy then asked me, Ma'am, are you alleging fraud? Harassment? Trespass attempt? Or all of the above? Beautiful question. Preciso. Scoped. Useful. I answered just as precisely. At minimum, attempted unlawful entry through false representation of authority. Harassment. And knowingly false statements about ownership. I said, if Grant wants to explain why he believes he has standing at my residence, Nora is happy to let him do that in front of the deputy. Grant looked at me like I'd broken some private sibling rule. And I had. The old rule was this. Grant gets to make the first ugly move. And Nora has to respond in a way that preserves everyone else's comfort. No more, he said. You're unbelievable. I didn't reply. That was the silence part. Not empty silence. Directed silence. There's a kind of control people mistake for passivity when a woman uses it. You don't answer the insult. You don't defend your personality. You don't clarify your tone. You just leave the other person alone with the structure they were hoping to outrun. So I let him stand there, on my porch, beside his unused locksmith, in front of my neighbor, under a deputy's stare, with my deed in one hand and his lie still drying in the air. Deputy Boone turned to the locksmith. Did he tell you he owned the property? He asked. The locksmith, a stocky guy with tired eyes and the survival instincts of someone who had seen messy people before breakfast, said, he told me it was inherited family property, and that his sister was wrongfully withholding access. Wrongfully withholding access. That phrase almost made me laugh. As if living alone in your own house had become a hostile act because your brother arrived with tools and confidence, Grant said. That's essentially true. No. And again. I said nothing. People who are lying hate factual silence more than argument. Argument lets them improvise. Silence forces them to hear how absurd they already sound. Deputy Boone asked the next necessary question. Do you have any probate filing? Estate document. Power of attorney. Court order. Or written authorization connecting you to this property? Grant hesitated. Again. Then he said, not on me. That answer told the deputy everything and wine. Not because it was technically impossible, some document existed elsewhere, but because people with real authority don't bring locksmiths first, and paperwork second. They bring paperwork first. Or attorneys. Or court orders. They do not arrive with a tradesman and a story. If Grant had authority, he would have brought paper. The fact that he brought a locksmith meant even he knew his strongest tool was surprise. I watched Deputy Boone's posture shift almost imperceptibly. That's when I knew the scene had turned. No longer a confusing family dispute. No longer, he said. She said. No longer a deputy trying to de-escalate some mutual misunderstanding. Now it was one woman inside a legally documented residence. One man outside, without proof. And one very bad decision, involving a third-party contractor. Grant sensed it too. So he went meaner. He pointed at me through the glass and said, you always do this. You weaponize paperwork, because you can't win on character. There it was. Not merely insult. Not just sibling poison. Public reputational attack in front of law enforcement and neighbors. Designed to make my competence look manipulative. I met his eyes through the glass, and said the coldest truthful thing I could find. Nora doesn't need to win on character. Nora already won at closing. Marisol actually barked a laugh. The locksmith looked away so he wouldn't smile. Deputy Boone didn't smile. But something around his mouth almost did. Grant flushed. Then, because his performance was collapsing, and because men like him often mistake escalation for recovery, he took one sharp step toward the locked storm door and put his hand on the handle. Deputy Boone's voice changed instantly. Take your hand off that door. Grant froze. Good. Because now we were past narrative and into conduct. And conduct is much easier to document than family feeling. I slid the county copy back into the folder, kept my hand steady on the inside latch, and said, Deputy Boone. Nora also has the text messages Grant sent last night before he arrived. That got everyone's attention, especially Grant's, because he knew exactly which texts I meant, and if the deed had established ownership. The messages were about to establish intent. Grant knew exactly which texts I meant. That was the beauty of it. Not because they were dramatic. They weren't. No cartoon villain language. No obvious confession. Just the kind of messages manipulative people send when they think they're being careful and don't realize careful language still leaves fingerprints. Deputy Boone stood 2 steps back from my porch and said, "If you have messages relevant to intent, I'd like to see them." Grant jumped in too fast. They're out of context. Always a promising sign. When someone hasn't even heard which messages you mean and already wants to litigate context, it usually means context is the only oxygen left in the room. I said, "Nora can email screenshots or read them through the door." "Your call, Deputy," he said. "Read them first." So I opened my phone, scrolled up, and found last night's thread. Grant had texted at 10:40 p.m. "You need to let me in tomorrow and stop acting like paperwork changes blood." Then at 10:47, "If you force this, I'll bring someone who can open it." And at 11:03, "You can either be reasonable in private or embarrassing in public. Your choice." I read each message once. No emphasis, no dramatics, no victory in my voice. Just words. The locksmith looked at Grant like a man mentally drafting the invoice note that would justify never taking his calls again. Marisol, from the lawn, said, "Well, that sounds terrible." With the calm satisfaction of someone who had suspected the worst and been rewarded early, Grant rubbed a hand over his face. "That's not what I meant," he said. But it was what he meant. And more importantly, it was what he had written. Grant's problem was never that Nora misunderstood him. It was that the written version of Grant was harder to charm than the spoken one. Deputy Boone asked, "Did you bring the locksmith in response to those messages?" Grant tried something new then. Softer voice. Less swagger. "The Wounded Son Register. I brought him because Nora has been stonewalling me for months," he said. "Our mom died. There are family items in there. She keeps everything under lock and key and acts like I'm some threat." There it was. The pivot from ownership to sentiment, from house to heirlooms, from unlawful entry to wounded exclusion. This is how men like my brother survive public collapse. When one lie fails, they don't retreat. They resize. They look for a smaller moral stage where they might still play the injured party. And there was one problem with that performance too. I really did have every family item inventoried, because of course I did. After our mother died, I spent 3 Sundays cataloging the storage boxes Grant didn't want to sort but definitely wanted access to eventually. Jewelry, photos, recipe cards, 2 military medals from our grandfather, Mom's wedding ring from before the divorce, the brass clock she lied about loving, even the ugly ceramic angel she made us keep every December, like it had diplomatic immunity. I had photographed everything, labeled everything, shared the inventory file, time-stamped it, emailed it to Grant twice. He never opened the spreadsheet. That is another thing hidden inside women like me. People call us controlling when what they really mean is, we leave fewer places for lazy people to hide. I told Deputy Boone. Family items were cataloged after our mother died. Grant has the inventory. If he wants specific property released, he can request specific property without bringing tools to Nora's front door. Grant barked out a laugh. Right. Because Nora's so fair. Interesting word. Fair. He had spent the entire morning trying to force entry into a house he did not own. And now he wanted to debate fairness. That told me he was losing badly enough to reach for abstract morality. Deputy Boone asked the obvious next question. "Ma'am, is there any legal basis for your brother to claim occupancy? Ownership? Or emergency access to this residence?" "No," I said, "Non." The answer came out flat because it was flat. No calificación. No story. Just no. And that was the first hint. I think that Deputy Boone stopped seeing me as a defensive homeowner and started seeing me as something else entirely. The competent party. That shift matters. Because once law enforcement, neighbors, contractors, bankers, or judges decide you are the competent party, a manipulative relative loses one of his favorite weapons, making your calm look like coldness and his aggression look like concern. Grant felt that shift too, so he tried to punch through it. He pointed at the file folder in my hand and said, "You always have a file ready. That's your whole thing. You build a case before anyone even knows there's a problem." That line would have embarrassed me 5 years earlier. Not anymore, because he was right about one thing. I do build the file early. That is why my life keeps standing after people like Grant try to improvise on top of it. I keep county copies, insurance scans, settlement statements, camera history, tax receipts, message threads, contractor invoices, shared family inventories, spreadsheets no one thanks me for until the room catches fire. And suddenly, standing behind that locked storm door with my brother unraveling on the porch, I understood exactly what my hidden value in this story was. Not secret wealth, not social power, not some mystery ally waiting in the wings. System intelligence. The kind most people dismiss as uptight, until they need someone who can produce the right page in under 10 seconds, while a liar is still looking for his next sentence. Grant thought Nora's strength was the deed. It wasn't. The deed was just one page inside a life she had already made almost impossible to hijack. Deputy Boone asked if I would email him the screenshots and deed copy for the incident note. Absolutely, I said. Grant looked at him sharply. Incident note? There. A little crack of panic. Because men like my brother don't mind causing scenes. They mind paperwork that survives the scene after the audience leaves. Deputy Boone said, "You attempted entry without proof of authority." "I'm documenting the contact." Grant opened his mouth, closed it. Then I said the sentence that changed everything from neighborhood embarrassment into something much more dangerous for him. Nora can also provide the email Grant sent last month asking whether changing the locks would send the right message before mediation. This time, even Marisol stopped pretending she was just casually outside. And Grant, for the first time all morning, looked not angry. Afraid. Afraid is a better look on liars than outrage. More honest, because the second I mentioned that email, Grant's whole body did something his mouth hadn't done all morning. It admitted the situation had a history, not a misunderstanding, not an impulsive brother making one bad call, not a family disagreement that accidentally turned into a locksmith on a porch. A pattern. That is always the second hidden layer in stories like this. The ugly act in public is almost never the first act. It is just the first act with witnesses. Deputy Boone looked at me and said, "You mentioned mediation." Mediation over what? There it was. The next good question. And the answer mattered. Because Grant had spent the entire morning trying to build one false frame, that I was hoarding something that morally belonged to both of us. If I answered carelessly, he could still try to drag the scene into grief. Inheritance. Sibling resentment. Anything broad enough to hide inside, so I answered narrowly. After our mother died, we had a dispute over personal property distribution and reimbursement claims related to her storage unit, funeral expenses, and 2 informal loans Grant says our mother made to me. I said. Marisol let out a quiet, unimpressed sound from the lawn. Because yes, of course, there are always informal loans in these stories. Mysterious family debts that emerge only when a woman owns something visible and a man wants to cut a moral side door into her title. Grant jumped in immediately. She did loan her money, he said. For the condo. Before the divorce. Everybody knew that. Wrong again. Not everybody. Not documented. Not real in the way he needed it to be. Our mother had helped once. 10 years earlier. A $4,000 bridge loan when Owen and I were short at closing on a condo so small, the oven door hit the opposite cabinet if you opened both at the same time. I paid Lorraine back over 11 months by check. I had the memo lines. I had the bank images. I had the thank you text she sent after the last payment cleared. Grant, meanwhile, had taken his temporary help in cash. In deferred bills. In one co-signed credit card, our mother quietly paid down for him, after he maxed it out during what he called an investment phase, and everyone else called unemployment with ego. Grant's favorite family debt was always the one someone else supposedly owed, never the one he had already left behind like cigarette smoke in another person's kitchen. I still didn't argue. Not directly. I went to my email, found the thread, and read aloud the line he had hoped would stay buried inside polite phrasing. If you won't open the place up voluntarily, maybe changing the lock sends the right message before mediation. No threats. No profanity. No obvious confession. Just strategic coercion in business casual language. Deputy Boone asked. Did you send that? Mr. Whitaker? Grant made the mistake guilty people make when they don't yet realize denial will cost more than nuance. I didn't mean literally, he said. There it was. Not fake. Not edited. Not taken out of context. His. The locksmith actually took 2 steps farther off my porch, which I respected. A man deciding in real time that he did not want to become the literally in someone else's police note. Deputy Boone said, You brought a locksmith to the residence today after sending that message? Grant didn't answer immediately. I didn't help him. That silence again. Useful silence. The kind that lets the structure tighten on its own. He finally said, I was trying to get access to family property. No. And this is where the suspicion widened. Because if this had only been about heirlooms photos, jewelry, keepsakes, old paperwork, Grant had options. He could have requested them by list. He could have had counsel contact me. He could have answered the inventory spreadsheet I had already sent. He could have proposed supervised retrieval. He could have shown up with a copy of the list and asked for 3 boxes and a civil timestamp. Instead, he brought a locksmith, and that meant access wasn't the point. Control was. Deputy Boone asked me, Has he ever lived here? No. Received mail here? No. Stored authorized property here beyond what you permitted? Yes. I said. Temporarily after our mother died. Documented pickup and return. No current claim. That answer mattered because it showed what I had and hadn't done. I hadn't shut him out irrationally. I had created controlled access, documented it, and ended it. In other words, I had already behaved like the reasonable party before he ever arrived with tools. That is another hidden layer in being underestimated. By the time someone tries to make you look difficult, you have often already built the record proving you were fair. Grant looked at the deputy and tried again. She keeps saying documented like that changes the emotional reality here. No. I thought. It changes the legal one. Which is the only reality that matters when you're standing outside my front door with a locksmith. But what I said was even simpler. Nora documents things because Grant revises conversations once he leaves them. That landed hard, because it was true in a way everyone there could suddenly feel. Even if they had only known him for 10 minutes. Marisol crossed her arms tighter and said, That sounds right. I did not look at her. I didn't need to. Support is strongest when it arrives uncollected. Grant spent years treating memory like wet clay. Nora's real power was that she had started firing everything into ceramic before he touched it. Deputy Boone asked one more question. And it turned the whole morning. Why did you believe changing the locks would send the right message? Mr. Whitaker? Beautiful. Not. Did you mean it? Were you frustrated? Can everybody calm down? Why did you believe that would send the right message? That question forced motive out into daylight. Grant laughed lightly. Too lightly. It was rhetoric. He said. Family tension. You know how people say things. No. Not people like me. I do not say things around assets, access, and coercion. I write exactly what I can defend. That difference is why I was inside the house and he was outside it losing ground. Deputy Boone's face stayed flat. You showed up with a locksmith. So I'm asking again. Grant looked toward me through the storm door and, for 1 second, I saw it clearly, not just greed. Un but humiliation. He had expected a confrontation he could dominate. What he got instead was a woman with records. A neighbor with eyes. A contractor with ethics. And a deputy who kept asking the questions in the right order. So he did what people like him do when their polished version starts failing. He got sloppier. He said, because Nora only responds when pressure becomes real. That sentence changed the air. Because there it was. The admission. Not about ownership. About strategy. He had not brought the locksmith because he believed he had authority. He had brought one because he believed pressure would make me yield. And suddenly the morning was no longer about a property misunderstanding with family overtones. It was about attempted coercion. Deputy Boone looked at me and said, Ma'am, do you want him formally trespassed from the property today? Grant turned so fast it almost looked like panic. And that was when I understood something else. The locksmith had been the blunt instrument. The email had been the preview. But the real story here had started weeks earlier. In the background, where Grant had already been building a case he thought I didn't know about. Because people do not jump this quickly to public coercion, unless private efforts have already failed. I tightened my grip on the folder and said, before Nora answers that, Deputy Boone should probably know who Grant called at the mortgage servicer last month, pretending to be connected to the property. That sentence hit Grant harder than the deed had. Before Nora answers that, Deputy Boone should probably know who Grant called at the mortgage servicer last month, pretending to be connected to the property. He didn't even try to hide the reaction. His mouth tightened, his shoulders lifted, and for the first time that morning, the arrogance cracked wide enough for panic to show through. That's the thing about people like my brother. They can survive embarrassment. They can even survive being caught in one lie if they think they can relabel it later. What they cannot survive is the appearance of a trail they didn't know you had. Deputy Boone looked at him and said, Did you contact the mortgage company regarding this address? Grant answered too quickly. I called with a question. Not no. Never no. Just the first small retreat into vagueness. I stayed still behind the storm door. No triumph. No lecture. No family history speech. Because by then, the structure was doing the work for me. If I stayed calm and specific, Grant would keep doing what cornered people always do, reveal more while trying to reveal less. So I said, Grant called asking whether there was hardship exposure, whether the loan was solely serviced, and whether a family dispute could trigger a review of ownership or occupancy. Marisol actually said, Oh, wow. Out loud. Good. Because sometimes a story needs one civilian voice to remind everybody which part is insane. Grant swung toward her. You need to mind your business. Wrong move. Very wrong move. Now he wasn't just the brother with a locksmith. He was the man on a residential street trying to intimidate a neighbor while standing in front of law enforcement. That kind of social miscalculation sticks to a person. Deputy Boone cut in immediately. Mr. Whitaker. You do not get to direct the neighbors. Grant turned back and spread his hands. Offended now. Like the scene had become unfair to him. This is ridiculous. He said, I made a call. People make calls. Nora hoards paperwork and freezes everybody out. And suddenly I'm the criminal? Grant's favorite defense was always the same. Shrink the act. Enlarge the woman reacting to it. And hope the room forgets who brought the locksmith. I still didn't raise my voice. Nora didn't call the mortgage servicer pretending to have standing. I said, Nora didn't bring a locksmith. Nora didn't threaten public humiliation by text. Nora answered the door with documents. That landed in layers. The locksmith looked embarrassed on Grant's behalf now. Not scared. Embarrassed. Which is worse. Fear passes. Embarrassment lingers, especially when it's being felt by a stranger who came expecting routine work and found himself standing inside someone else's failing scam. Deputy Boone asked me, "How do you know about the mortgage servicer call?" Beautiful again. Because the answer made Grant's problem wider. "I have account monitoring enabled," I said. The servicer flagged an unauthorized inquiry attempt and logged the phone number used. It matched Grant's. Grant actually laughed then. But it came out thin. "You set your life up like a surveillance state," he said. "No. I set my life up like someone who had met Grant Whitaker before. That was the difference. People called me rigid because they only ever saw the record-keeping after someone else's behavior made it necessary. They never understood that meticulousness is often just intelligence that got tired of being surprised by the same kind of man." Deputy Boone looked at Grant and said, "Did you identify yourself as owner or authorized party?" Grant hesitated. That pause told the truth before his mouth got there. "I said I was family," he muttered. There it was. The whole operating system. Not owner, not legal representative, not attorney, not occupant. Family. Because Grant believed blood was a skeleton key. Not morally. Maybe. Not even consciously in a clean philosophical way. He just moved through the world, assuming family title could be inflated into access, influence, standing, and eventually control if he pushed hard enough and met too little resistance. Only this morning, he had finally run into resistance with receipts. Deputy Boone said, "Did you or did you not imply authority you did not have?" Grant's face flushed dark. "I was trying to get information," he snapped. Not an answer again. And by then even he knew it. The escalation turned ugly fast after that. He stopped trying to sound reasonable and started trying to injure the posma. Those are two very different modes. And once men like Grant switch, they almost always overplay. He pointed at me through the glass and said, "You've always loved this. Acting superior because you know forms and systems and technicalities. You build walls and call them boundaries." There it was. The emotional bid. The invitation to defend my personality, instead of his conduct. I refused it. Grant is angry because Nora's walls have dates. Signature. And logs. I said. Marisol picked up her coffee again, like she intended to survive this comfortably. Deputy Boone then said something that finally changed Grant's posture. "If the homeowner requests it, I can issue a criminal trespass warning today. If you return after that without lawful cause, the next conversation goes differently." That hit hard, because until that moment, Grant still thought he was in a family argument with props. Suddenly, he was in contact with consequence. Real consequence. The kind that leaves a name in a system. Not just a bad memory in a neighborhood. He looked at me then, not at the deputy. Not at the locksmith. Not at Marisol. At me. And what I saw in his face wasn't regret. It was fury that Nora had become a person he could no longer rush past. That's when he made the mistake I think finally killed any sympathy he might have had left on the street. He said, loud and sharp, "Fine. But when mediation opens everything up, don't cry when people find out what you hid after Mom died." There it was. A fresh lie. Public. Desperate. Thrown like a bottle, because the first fire hadn't spread. I looked at him for one long second. Then I said, "If Grant wants mediation to open everything, then Grant should be very sure he wants the reimbursement ledger, the storage unit invoices, and the signed release Mom had him execute in 2024, entered into the same file." Grant went white. The locksmith looked at him. Deputy Boone looked at him. Even Marisol stopped sipping. And suddenly the morning wasn't just about a brother losing control. It was about everyone realizing he had shown up to my house betting on the wrong sibling, having fewer records. Grant went white because he remembered the signed release. Not vaguely. Not the way people sort of remember documents from messy family months. He remembered it with the exact terror of a man who had once signed something casually, assuming the woman across from him would stay too polite to ever use it. He had signed it in Marisol's dining room. Actually, that detail mattered to me, because 8 months earlier, after our mother died, Marisol had done me one enormous favor. She let us use her table when I told her I wanted a witness present for the final distribution of Lorraine's storage unit contents and the reimbursement paperwork Grant kept dodging. Not because I distrusted him in some theatrical, cinematic way. Because I distrusted him in the boring, data-backed way women learn to distrust men who rewrite numbers after they leave the room. The release was simple, very clean, very ordinary. Grant acknowledged receipt of the personal property inventory, acknowledged the cash reimbursement total I had fronted for funeral travel, storage unit closure, and the final utility balance on our mother's apartment, acknowledged that he had taken specific items in lieu of contesting further household property claims, and acknowledged that no real property claim existed between us arising from Lorraine Whitaker's estate. No real property claim existed. Grant didn't just bring a locksmith to a house he didn't own. He did it after signing a document acknowledging he had no property claim tied to our mother at all. Deputy Boone must have seen something shift in Grant's face, because he asked, "What release is she referring to?" Grant tried to recover. "It was informal," he said. "Just family paperwork." That phrase again. Family paperwork. As if documents become decorative the moment a woman drafts them competently. I almost smiled. "No," I said. It was witnessed settlement language with signatures, dates, itemized attachments, and acknowledgement of no real property claim. Then I added the line that finished him socially. Marisol Kent witnessed it. All eyes went to her. Marisol did not flinch, did not overperform, did not even look pleased. She just said, "I did." Then, after one beat, "Because she is a better woman than most people deserve," she added. Grant read it. Twice. Complained about one paragraph. Signed anyway. That was the reveal. Not just the paper, the triangulation, the deputy, the witness, the prior email, the deed, the mortgage inquiry, the text about bringing someone who could open it, the locksmith, and now a signed release that stripped Grant of his favorite fallback fantasy, that this was all just unresolved family ambiguity, and Nora was being rigid about it. No, this was never ambiguity. This was a man trying 5 different tools in sequence. After the first 4 failed, Deputy Boone said, "Do you have a copy available now?" Of course I did. That is the difference between me and Grant in one sentence. He brings a locksmith. I bring the record. I stepped away from the entry table, went to the home office cabinet, and pulled the gray folder labeled L. Whitaker, final distribution. Inside, scan printouts. The signed release. The itemized property sheet. Reimbursement ledger. And the email chain where Grant first called the numbers cold, and then signed anyway after realizing the alternatives were worse. I came back, held the release to the storm glass, then unlocked only the slot window panel enough to pass it out to Deputy Boone without opening the main barrier. That detail mattered to me too. Control isn't only about winning. It's about never giving the wrong person an opening, just because you're being asked to prove you're right. Deputy Boone read in silence. Then he asked Grant, "Is this your signature?" Grant looked at the page. At Marisol. At me. At the locksmith, who was now fully emotionally invested in watching another man's stupidity become official. Grant said, "That wasn't meant to cover this house." Wrong answer. Because the document didn't need to mean anything emotionally. It said exactly what it said. No real property claim existed between us arising from Lorraine's estate. And since Grant's entire porch performance had depended on implying some inherited family property fog attached to my house, the release didn't just weaken him. It exposed intent. He had not misunderstood. He had tried to manufacture leverage out of a claim he had already waived. The deputy's question wasn't just about ownership anymore. It was about whether Grant knew he had no claim and showed up anyway with tools. Deputy Boone asked, "Did you represent to the locksmith that this was inherited family property?" "Yes." But, Ward, but, He kept talking. Because Nora has always mixed Mom's money into her assets and then acted like nothing connects. There it was. His last refuge. Narrative contamination. Take one old financial overlap. Smear it across every later achievement. Call independent ownership morally. Suspect enough that boundaries look selfish. This is how some men try to repossess women's lives after the fact. Not with proof. With emotional accounting. With the suggestion that if a mother ever helped, if a husband ever co-signed, if a family member ever lent, then your eventual success should remain permanently soft around the edges. No, absolutely not, I said. The condo bridge loan was repaid in full. The checks are in the file. The down payment sources for this house are in the settlement statement. If Grant wants every dollar traced, Nora is happy to trace every dollar. That line silenced him better than outrage ever could have. Because tracing money is where men like Grant die in public. They thrive in implication. They rot in columns. Deputy Boone handed the release back through the slot and said, very calmly, at this point, I'm satisfied there is no lawful basis for your presence here, for entry purposes. Mr. Whitaker. There it was. Authority. Not dramatic. Not shouted, but final enough that the whole street could feel the weight shift. Grant's face darkened. He looked at me and said, you planned for this. I met his eyes and told him the truth. No, I said. Nora planned for Grant. That was the real reveal. Not that I had secret influence. Not that I knew a deputy. Not that some miraculous witness happened to be outside in a robe with coffee. My hidden power had never been mystery. It was preparation, the kind built by years of dealing with regulated systems. Sloppy men. And the cost of being the person who gets called too much right before everyone needs exactly your version of enough. Deputy Boone then asked me the question that turned the legal corner fully. Do you want him formally trespassed from the property? I looked at Grant. Really looked at him. At the entitlement still trying to pretend it was injury. At the public, lie collapsing under private paper. At the locksmith he had dragged into it. At the neighbor who had witnessed both the signing months earlier and the unraveling later. At the deputy who now had a cleaner story than most property confrontations ever provide. And I realized this had already gone beyond one bad Tuesday. Because if he had tried the servicer once, if he had drafted lock language in email once, if he had shown up with tools today, then whatever came next would only get quieter and uglier unless I ended it on paper now. So I answered, yes. I said, Nora wants the warning issued. And Nora wants the incident number. Grant stared at me like I had broken the final family rule. Maybe I had. Good. Because the next thing he was about to lose wasn't just access. It was the right to pretend this had ever been a misunderstanding. Grant stared at me like I had betrayed something sacred. Not the law. Not the truth. The family script. That old, rotten script where he got to overreach, and I was supposed to absorb it privately, so nobody had to watch a son look small in public. Too late. Deputy Boone took out his pad and began the trespass warning in the same tone men use when sealing crates. No anger. No flourish. Just sequence. Name. Address. Date. Instruction. Consequence. That tone did something beautiful to Grant. It shrank him. Not physically. Socially. Because once another man with institutional standing starts speaking to you like the disruptive party, all the old tricks stop landing. The older brother voice stops sounding protective. The wounded son expression stops sounding sincere. The family language starts looking exactly like what it is. A costume over unauthorized behavior. The locksmith shifted his case from one hand to the other and asked, Am I clear to go? Deputy Boone said, Yes. Sid, you are not involved beyond being called here, under false representation. Under false representation, Grant didn't just lose the argument. He lost the right to frame himself as anything except the man who had brought a tradesman to a house he had no legal path into. The locksmith nodded once at me. Not warm. Not theatrical. Just respectful. and walked back to his van. That small nod mattered more than it should have. There is something quietly restoring about a stranger correctly identifying which person in a conflict has been carrying reality the whole time. Marisol called from her lawn. "You okay, Nora?" Grant flinched at that, because even now, even after everything, another person's concern was going to me. Not to him. "I'm fine," I said, and I was. That was the part I think he hated most. Not that he'd been stopped. Not that the deputy believed me. Not even that the release existed. That I wasn't shaking. He had come for panic. For tears. For some public unraveling he could later summarize as, "Nora made it ugly." Instead he got stillness. Paper. A witness. A deputy. A filet. And a woman who answered every escalation by making the room more precise. Deputy Boone finished the warning and said, "Mr. Whitaker, you are advised not to return to this address without invitation or lawful cause. Do you understand?" Grant didn't answer right away. Of course he didn't. Because silence, when he uses it, is never strategy. It's delay. A last-second search for some version of the morning where he is not the cautionary tale. The deputy repeated. "Do you understand?" Grant said. "Yes." There. One syllable. One humiliation. One legal narrowing of his imagined role. Then he turned to me and made his final mistake. Not shouting. Not threatening. Something more revealing. He said, "You'll regret making this official. Not this misunderstanding. Not this overreaction. Not calling the deputy. This. Official." Which meant he knew exactly what had frightened him all along. Not my anger. Not my memory. Not even my ownership. The record. Because once something becomes official, men like Grant lose their favorite terrain. A revision. Grant was never afraid of Nora's feelings. He was afraid of Nora's documentation becoming part of a system he could not talk over. I looked him in the eye through the storm door and said, "Grant should have thought about official when he booked the Locksmith." Even Deputy Boone glanced at me for half a second after that. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was clean. The kind of sentence that closes the right file in the right way. Grant laughed once. But it was dead on arrival. Then he tried a new route. The oldest one. The one manipulative relatives reach for when law, witnesses, and paper all stop working. "Mother," he said. "Mom would be disgusted by this." No. And because I had spent enough of my life letting dead women get drafted into live men's opportunism, I did not let that one breathe. "Lorraine Whitaker would be disgusted by the locksmith," I said, and by Grant trying to force a house conversation out of a deed that never touched her estate. Using our mother's full name did exactly what I wanted. It removed her from his sentimental possession and placed her back into the record as a person with boundaries, signature, and actual circumstances. Grant's mouth tightened. Good. Because the power had fully shifted by then. Not in some melodramatic movie sense, where the villain is suddenly speechless and the crowd applauds. Real power shift is quieter. It's when the liar begins reacting to your framework instead of the other way around. It's when the official asks you the follow-up questions, because you are clearly the reliable narrator. It's when the witnesses stop scanning both faces and start watching only one. It's when the person who came to destabilize you has to ask permission just to leave with a shred of dignity. Grant said, "Can I at least get the family photo albums?" That was new. Smaller. Weaker. Task-shaped. Interesting. Because that is what happens when you strip a man of improvised authority. He finally has to ask for specific things like a normal person. I said, "Grant can email a list?" Not cruel. Not warm. Just proper. He looked at Deputy Boone as if maybe the deputy would force some softer family bridge between us. But Deputy Boone had already categorized the morning correctly. He wasn't there to repair sibling intimacy. He was there to manage conduct. He said, "That sounds reasonable." Grant swallowed whatever he had planned to say next. Then he walked off my porch. Not fast. Not slow. Just without the swagger he arrived with. That mattered too. Because a person can lose public standing in increments. First the question, then the document, then the witness, then the note, then the warning. By the end, they are still wearing the same clothes they started in. But the social shape of them has changed. Marisol watched him go all the way to his car. Then she called. "You want me to stay until he's gone?" I did, but I also wanted something else more. To stand in my own doorway and not need saving. So I said, "I'm good. Thank you." She nodded once. And still in the robe. Still barefoot in slippers. And I made a note right then to send her flowers later, not because she rescued me, but because she witnessed correctly. That is rarer than help. Grant got into his car. Sat there for 10 full seconds. Then finally backed out. No dramatic tiresquel. No final speech. Just departure. And that was the reversal in its purest form. He had come to demonstrate that I was isolated. Unstable. Over-attached to paperwork. And morally soft around ownership. Instead, the street watched him get documented. Warned. Disproven. And sent away from a house that had never needed his permission to stand. Grant arrived as if he were coming to reclaim something. He left looking like what he had actually been all morning, a man trespassing on another person's order. Deputy Boone handed me the incident number through the slot window and said, "Ma'am, keep all communication in writing from here." I almost smiled. "Already do," I said. That got the smallest reaction from him. Not amusement, exactly. Recognition. Because by then he knew too. This morning had not gone my way by accident. It had gone my way. Because I had built a life where facts had somewhere to live before crisis came knocking. As he turned back toward his cruiser, he said, "If he contacts the servicer again, or comes back, call us. Not if things escalate emotionally. Not if the family dynamic gets tense. Not if I feel unsafe in some vague feminine register. If he contacts the servicer again. If he comes back. Specific conduct. Specific remedy." That's when I knew the entire frame had changed. I closed the slot window. Locked the inner latch. Stood in my hallway with the folder still in my hand. And for one long second, I let myself feel it. Not relief. Not exactly. Restoration. The kind that comes when someone tries to publicly reduce you to a role you outgrew years ago. And the record calmly, thoroughly, beautifully refuses. After Grant left, the house sounded different. Sammy refrigerator, Same old pipe knock. When the upstairs faucet shut off too fast. Same maple branches brushing the front window in the wind. But the air had changed. Not because my brother was gone. Because the last false version of me had gone with him. I locked the front door. Then locked it again. Not from fear. Just sequence. I put the gray folder back in the cabinet. Uploaded the new video clips. Saved the deputy's incident number in 3 places. And emailed the screenshots. Deed copy. Release. And mortgage servicer note to a new folder labeled exactly what it was. Whitaker trespass, 814A.M. That name matters. One of the quietest forms of dignity is refusing to let chaos stay unclassified. Marisol knocked 20 minutes later with actual coffee and no questions I didn't want. She stood in my kitchen, looked around once, and said, "You were ready." Not impressed, not pitying, just accurate. "Yes," I said. Then she gave the kind of compliment women understand better than men ever seem to. "Good," she said. "Because he came here assuming you wouldn't be." That was the whole story in one line. Grant had never really believed he could beat the law. He believed he could beat my hesitation. He thought if he moved fast enough, loudly enough, publicly enough, I would slide back into the old family role, the competent woman who protects everyone else from consequences by swallowing the insult and handling the cleanup later. No, not anymore. Grant did not lose because Nora was crueler. Grant lost because Nora finally stopped being useful to his version of the family. The next week got quieter in the way real aftermath, always does. No dramatic showdown. No immediate apology. No cinematic collapse. Just consequences. The locksmith's company emailed to confirm they had flagged the call as a misrepresentation incident and would not return to my address without direct owner authorization. The mortgage servicer added a note to the file requiring enhanced verification on any inquiry tied to the property. Deputy Boone's report was finalized and available for reference if Grant came back. My attorney, because yes, I already had one. And yes, that fact would have offended Grant even more, sent a short, efficient letter instructing him to direct any future property-related communication through counsel and to cease unauthorized contact with vendors, lenders, or service providers connected to my residence. That letter did what the deputy's warning could not. It moved the whole thing out of family fog forever. Grant sent one furious email that night. 3 paragraphs, heavy on betrayal, light on facts. He called me cold, called me vindictive, said I had criminalized grief, said Mom would never have wanted outsiders involved. Outsiders. That word tells you everything about certain men. The moment institutions stop favoring their improvisation, they start calling institutions outsiders as if documentation, police reports, attorneys, servicers, and signatures are somehow less legitimate than a brother's appetite. I didn't reply. My attorney did. 4 lines. No emotion. No openings. After that, Grant got smaller. That's what actual accountability does. It reduces a person to the size of what they can prove. And once he was forced into that size, there was almost nothing left. No claim to the house. No valid access. No estate tie. No heirloom emergency. No servicer standing. No moral fog that could survive the release he had signed. No neighbor willing to nod along. No deputy willing to call it a misunderstanding. Just one man who had brought a locksmith to a house he didn't own and learned, too late, that Nora Whitaker had built her life to withstand exactly that kind of man.